Okay, good morning, everybody. Great to see you all here. I'm Peter Norvig. I'm an AI hipster. I was doing it before it was cool. And it's my pleasure to be here today with Gary Marcus, a leading figure in the field, a noted cognitive scientist, a professor, an entrepreneur, and most relevant for today, an author. So Gary, welcome back to Stanford. I know you spent a year here 20 years ago, and it's great to have you back. And welcome to HAI. You and I have known each other for a long time, and we've both been observing and participating in this field. And I think we both see potentials for both the benefits and pitfalls. And maybe I'm a little bit more on the glass half full side. But tell us, what prompted you to write this new book, and what's the overall message?
So it's not my first book about AI. My last book about AI was really about how to make it better from a technical perspective. And I wrote a book in 2001 that was really about cognitive science and how, from a cognitive science perspective, a mind ought to work and how it might work. And I actually talked about things like hallucinations and neural networks. So I've been thinking about this kind of stuff for a long time. But this book, I'm sorry, I'm going to cough a lot. This book is really about policy. And it really, in some ways, grew from the fact that I testified at the US Senate last year, about 15, 16 months ago. And it was kind of the most exciting moment of my life to stand there in front of the Senate. I was next to Sam Altman. And we talked about how we might build an AI agency, why the need for regulation was urgent. And there was stunning bipartisan consensus. Everybody in the room seemed to think, yeah, we need an AI agency. We need to deal with how fast AI is moving and so forth. And then nothing happened, right? So the White House did pass an executive order, but in particular, nothing happened in the Senate. There was no law that was brought to a Senate vote, nothing was brought to the president to sign. And I became more and more disappointed and disillusioned and realized that we're not going to get the AI policy we need if we just rely on the government, and self-regulation isn't going to cut it either. And so I realized that we need to have the people of the United States realize how important AI policy is. And that's why I wrote the book.
Okay. And to me, I feel like I agree with you that it's tough to get the government to take on the whole role. And I think it's kind of should be multifaceted. Yes, we need to prompt the government to do a better job. The companies have to do self-regulation. Maybe there should be processes for external audits of the companies. Maybe there can be professional societies can step up, third-party nonprofit certifiers. Like last time there was a scare that a technology was going to kill everybody. It was electricity over 100 years ago. And Underwriters Laboratory came in and said...
There were bioweapons in between the...
Yeah, there were others. But Underwriters Laboratory said, we're going to put a sticker on your toaster that says it won't kill you. And companies voluntarily submitted themselves to that certification because the consumers agreed in it. And I think you're saying we should have better consumer advocacy groups and that we should have better education for everybody. So do we need all these things? Which are the most important? How are we going to get there?
I think we don't fully know the answer yet. I mean, the reason I wrote the book was to lay out, my best suggestions about what we might do. I love the Underwriters Laboratory model. I'm not sure it's sufficient. I think one thing that we've seen over the last couple of years is that the big tech companies can make big talk about wanting to do things and then they back down. So, Sam Altman, when he was next to me in the Senate, testified how important regulation was. And meanwhile, his own people were lobbying the EU, saying, hey, water down the EU AI Act. And now his people are arguing against SB 1047, which I think is actually a good idea, though one could argue about it. So I don't think self-regulation is going to work. Having some kind of consumer seal would be good. I think we could look at the AI that we have right now, and there's a lot of negative externalities to it. So the environmental costs are enormous. The intellectual property costs are enormous. So artists and writers are getting ripped off. The reliability is not that good. There's possibility of defamation, misinformation. If we could in any way get companies to be more responsible to these issues, guarantee that they will license things, try to find ways to address the environmental costs and so forth, then that would be great. If some of that came from like underwriters laboratory kind of stuff, that would be great. I'm not sure that's enough. I think ultimately we need to think about case studies like OpenAI just said that there was a medium risk of bioweapons problems associated with their newest model. Now, some people will say OpenAI is just doing that to make their software sound bigger, more important. It's just hype, and it might be, but it's also a really good thought experiment. And so let's imagine that the next model really is outright dangerous. Who gets to decide whether it's released? I'm not sure an underwriter's label is enough to resolve that sort of thing. If you had a new technology that really could cause major risk to mankind, you would actually want humanity to have some say about whether to release it. And right now, any CEO who has this technology can do whatever they want. They can ignore their own employees, they can ignore the government. So I like the UA label kind of thing, but I don't think it goes far enough to address issues like that.
And I guess beyond the CEO, you can have smaller rogue groups. And currently, if you want the biggest frontier model, that's a big capital investment, but these much smaller models are nearly as good. You mentioned OpenAI looking at the bioweapons thing. I think Anthropic did a similar study where they got the sort of the best experts there and said, we're okay for now, but there are potential problems in the future. One of the things I wanted to get back to was, yes, we want appropriate legislation. To what extent does existing legislation work, and to what extent does it have to be completely new, right? So most of the things we have laws on focuses on the harm and not on the technology, right? If you steal some money, doesn't matter if you do it with a gun or with a computer. Mostly the laws are the same. What's different here? What can be covered by existing law? You mentioned the intellectual property. I think we have copyright law. It seems like in that case that's not enough, because there's one thing to copy verbatim something that you get off the web, but there's another thing to learn from it and then generate something that's a riff on it. Where do we need brand new laws, and where can we just apply the existing laws to these new technologies?
I'll start by saying nobody knows the answer to that question, but the general issue is under specification. The existing laws were written before AI was on the scene, and so don't anticipate certain things. I'll give you a few examples. Copyright law is one that you mentioned. Copyright law, maybe it covers current circumstances and maybe it doesn't. Fair use is a bit vague. My own personal view is that people who create things that are used to train models should get some compensation. We have to decide as a society what we think about that. We can try to leave it to the courts and so forth. Courts might or might not come to an answer society is happy with. And I would say training just wasn't anticipated. So you have, for example, many authors, yourself and myself included, who signed away rights to books, but never imagined they would be used for training. And we have to decide what we want to do about that. So it's one case. Another case would be defamation. Defamation laws often say, there has to be some intent. But what if people are using large language models at very large scale and defaming people routinely? Like, do we want to say that's okay just because, we're going to give a free pass to a hallucinatory LLM that makes up, sexual harassment charges that aren't real and things like that, which has actually happened? There is existing law, but it's, again, underspecified. I'll give you one other case. There was a very important paper, I think it was in Nature, but it might have been Science 2 weeks ago, on covert racism in LLMs. And what that paper showed, some of the authors might have been at Stanford, what that paper showed is if you talk to one of these systems in African-American English, you get a different answer. If you talk in standard English, that's going to affect things like job decisions. And we have an EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, that's supposed to address those things. But it's not clear that they can, for example, go to OpenAI or one of these companies and say, give me the logs. Let me see how this has actually happened in practice. So the law, again, is underspecified.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we need to be clearer, and maybe it's through writing new laws, maybe it's through application of case laws as we get some precedents. there is a big issue now with signing away the training rights. I know on my textbook, I did sign away the movie rights, and I'm kind of disappointed they haven't made a movie out of it yet, but maybe it's not the most promising source material. And I want to consider an
ChatGPT make a Russell and Norvig movie.
There you go. Yeah,
run it through Runway. It's going to be great.
Could be a hit. I want to go back to another example, which is when radio was invented. It was the first time you could hear music without sort of a physical connection. And we came up with this idea of saying, okay, every time a station plays a song, royalties get transferred. And I think that was mostly through agreements rather than through legislation. Is that a good model? I think we need something like that for content creators now, that anytime you train a model, you shouldn't have to go to copyright law and hire a lawyer. There just should be these small payments to everybody shared.
I would love to see that. I think that there's a lot of complex policy questions here. The notion that artists should be licensed, the writers should be licensed, is not complicated. Like, we should do that as a society. And there's two paths. One is a bunch of lawsuits, like the Times is suing OpenAI, for example, and the other is mutual agreements. And interestingly, places like OpenAI are pursuing both avenues. So even as they're telling the government, we need all this stuff for free, they're actually cutting lots of licenses. I hope that there is something that gives compensation to artists and creators and so forth. I'm a bit agnostic about how it actually happened. Let me go back just for 1 second.
Sure.
When I was mentioning how things are underspecified, maybe the most important of all I left out, which is Section 230 gives social media platforms immunity, essentially, for what they say. They don't have any liability. When I was at the Senate, everybody agreed we don't want that to cover AI. So if you have an AI company builds an LLM, which, by the way, we now know can implant false memories and things like that, you shouldn't be immune from liability for doing that. But we don't know whether Section 230 applies. Like Gorsuch, Justice Gorsuch kind of hinted that he thought maybe it shouldn't. But that's another place where the law just really hasn't been tested yet.
So you've mentioned a lot of things to watch out for. What are you most worried about? What keeps you up at night?
The single thing I'm most worried about in the near term is democracy. It's very easy to envision a world in which the outcome, let's say, of the US presidential election flips based on misinformation generated at scale cheaply by LLMs. That's a realistic possibility. There was an article in the Post today saying Russia is specifically trying to install Trump using AI. And that, who knows what the American people want? It's right on the edge. But that's kind of the point. If it's right on the edge and an outside party manipulate it, that's a really large cost of generative AI if it allows external actors to shape our elections. So that's my number one immediate concern. There are many others. So I have this table in the book where I have a dozen immediate concerns. And then I also say, I don't think the Terminator scenario is particularly likely right now. But who knows what happens in the future? Mostly I'm worried about what bad actors might do with large language models. And my concern is that for many of the positive use cases we might imagine, you really want accuracy, reliability, factuality, and so forth. For the negative cases, it doesn't matter as much. So somebody wants to generate misinformation, and they generate a whole lot of stuff, and some sticks and some doesn't, and some's true and some's not. They don't really care. And so there's actually an asymmetry between good actors and bad actors in how well they can use LLMs right now.
So if you'd asked me 2 years ago, I would have said I'd like to constrain open source models because if some bad actor is asking some malevolent queries, I want them to be logged somewhere so that we know that. Now it seems to me like that cat's out of the bag and there's no way to constrain the open source model.
I think we're going to regret that. I mean, open source is obviously a really complicated question. I would note as an aside that what we have meant by open source is not really what's happening in AI. So traditional open source, you can change any piece of the source code. We're really talking about models with open, and you can't change them in the same way. So you don't get all of the same benefits of traditional open source. But putting that aside, there's always value in accelerating technology. And in this particular technology, there are some potential costs having to do with bad actors. We've already seen them do that. My view is we should view generative AI as a dress rehearsal. It's not AGI. We're going to have much better technologies eventually. And we should learn from what happened with generative AI. One of the things we learned is that regulators are way too slow to do anything about it. They're not responsive. Another thing we've learned is that open sourcing may turn out to be a bad idea. We may not want the next technology to be open source. I know that makes me unpopular, but there are.
And now that we've depressed everybody, what can you do to liven that up? What possible benefits are you excited about?
So I would just say we should ban AI if I thought there was no value. I think I have deep trouble with generative AI and deep optimism that we'll come to an AI that's closer to what was in your book, right? In your text, you were talking about how you'd make reliable AI. It could actually reason and plan and so forth, and had chapters about those things. If we can do that, I think we can radically improve medicine, radically improve technology, help with climate change. I'm still bullish on all of that. Help with human reasoning. Humans are a low bar. I would say AI has not exceeded it yet. You probably remember my book, Klooge, where I talked about errors in human reasoning. There's lots of ways in which AI could improve on the human condition. I just don't think the tools that everybody obsessed with now, most of the chatbots, are the right way there.
So I definitely agree with you there, that I think, the first product we got was the chatbot, where you give it a prefix of a number of words, and then it just starts spitting out what's the next word and the word after that, and just goes. And to me, that's not an artificial intelligence. That's an artificial politician. They're really good at.
Someone told me yesterday this great phrase: "It's Mad Libs, but more expensive."
Exactly. And so I don't want something that just says, you give me N words and I start spitting out N+1. I want something that says, well, I'm going to think about that. I'm going to try multiple ways of looking at it. I'm going to criticize those possible ways. And only then, when I'm done with all that, then I'll start talking. And it seems like we've seen some of the examples of that. So DeepMind's AlphaProof got this silver medal in the Math Olympiads, which are unique problems that are very difficult and have never been published anywhere. OpenAI's O1 performs at a high level. Terence Tao said it's now at the level of a mediocre grad student in mathematics, which is a huge advance from all the previous models, which were incompetent at mathematics. So are they on the right track, or do we need something else?
I don't think the architectures we're building right now are on the right track. One of the reasons I always like talking with you is your dissertation was on story comprehension. Mm-hmm. And I always think that's a good example of a kind of AI we should be building, where you can be exposed to some set of events unfolding over time. You want to build an internal model, you want to make inference on that. And I still haven't really seen that, even with O1, whatever. O1 still makes stupid mistakes, it still hallucinates, and it doesn't really have the kind of explicit, queryable knowledge representation that was in your work and that I think we still need. So yes, these systems are getting better, and that means some real world consequence. So if you use them for brainstorming, they're probably going to be better at brainstorming. But it doesn't, it doesn't mean that we're on the right path to building AGI.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So another example, and the great thing about this field is it's moving so fast that you don't have to cite the classics. You can cite things that came out this month. So Di Yang here at Stanford had this paper where she asked professionals in the field and AI models to come up with novel ideas for natural language processing research. And then they were rated in a blind test, and the raters said the AI models were more creative, but the human models were more implementable. So maybe the AI models took the directions more seriously and came up with things that were farther out. So it seems like we've come a long way. Now you mentioned back in the dark ages in the 1980s, I was doing my thesis research in natural language understanding, and I always thought, at some point in my career, I will have an intelligent conversation with a computer. But I didn't think it would work out the way it did. I thought there's a lot going on the page, but I felt like there's much more going on in my head, and that you would need to have sort of a lived experience to really be able to understand what's on the page. I think we were all surprised to find out maybe there's more on the page than we thought, that human language encodes a lot more than we ever thought it did. And so without having lived experience, we can go much farther than anyone thought, although I think you're right in your criticisms that we aren't completely there yet. So what else do we need? And I guess the other thing I wanted to say is, I think these ideas from good old-fashioned AI are important, but I also think they have limitations. And
For sure. I mean, I think we need new ideas, to be honest. I think that we have two traditions. I like to think of them informally like Kahneman System 1 and System 2. So Kahneman System 1 is essentially statistical reasoning that's intuitive and fast, and so forth. And System 2 is more deliberative and slow. GoFi, good old-fashioned AI, is much more around System 2. And neural networks are based, at least as most people use them, are really more like System 1. And they have complementary strengths. So, if the thing that you want is close to something in a training set, you can get constant time, fast inference out of a neural network, and that's fabulous. If it's a little different from what you saw before, it can really break down. So like I've been sharing Twitter a lot of so-called river crossing examples where you have a goat and a wolf and a person and some cabbage, and they have to go, and you have to go across the water or something like that. And if you change the premises in small ways from the traditional problems, which require like 6 steps back and forth, you just make it a man and a woman in a boat have to go across the water, you get some insane answer. Like the man goes across, leaves the boat, swims back, somehow miraculously gets the boat again, and then brings the woman across. You look at these examples and you realize that the depth of understanding is still very shallow, and that you're relying on similarity to training set. If you deviate in some subtle way, it breaks down. And that's still fundamentally where we are. There was a study of math in 01 a couple of days ago. Sorry, I can't remember who did the study. And the graphs very much reminded me of work that I did in 1998. In 1998, I showed that early neural networks couldn't generalize. Let me say that more carefully. I argued that there were 2 kinds of generalization. It was what I called within training space generalization and beyond space generalization. And the simple example I gave back in 1998 with a simpler neural network, 3-layer neural net, was generalizing the identity function represented over binary numbers from an even number to an odd number. The systems could easily generalize the even numbers they had. So there's some generalization, but they failed to generalize the odd numbers. So 01 is 30 years later, and it will generalize to, it'll do addition with 10-digit numbers pretty well, and then it just falls apart when you get to like 11-digit numbers, 12-digit numbers, and so forth. We see the same hallmark over and over again. A calculator will do addition within its domain of application for every number, built to do that. Whereas essentially everything that is learned by a neural network is subject to similarity training set, and that always is.
Yeah, and I think you've done a fantastic job of bringing up these sort of test cases, and I always appreciate seeing other examples of where it goes wrong. And I guess to me, and maybe to many people, this was another thing that was unexpected, right? So I said, at some point I'll have an intelligent conversation with a computer, but I never thought something that would be so good at so many things would also be so bad at so many things.
So I've always been right about the bad things. The things that I predicted that they would fail on in my 2001 book have all held very, very strong. The things that they're good at, I didn't speculate as much, because to me it was always this question of within training space and beyond. And it turns out the bigger the training space, the better you do, which I always foresaw. But we always have this periphery that when you get to reasoning and planning and so forth, always fails. And you always have this problem of vaccination, and so forth. So I understand why people are spectacularly impressed by all of the successes. But the things that to me feel like hallmarks of what real cognition is, there's still failure and hasn't been so much progress.
Now, there are people on Less Wrong and other forums who make a career out of following you and saying, look, here's all the things that Gary said that ChatGPT 2 can't do, and he was right, but now ChatGPT 4 can do all of them. How do you respond to that?
This is a proof that humans can be just as superficial as neural nets. So always when I give examples, I try to clarify that the examples are illustrative of a larger problem. But the specific examples, when I'm careful, I say might be solved, right? Because everything depends on your training set. And we've, since from GPT to 4, scaled the training set by, I don't know, 3 orders of magnitude, 5 orders of magnitude. Someone in the room might know. Many specific examples get covered. Many cases, even if they aren't specifically covered, are close to something that was added to the training set and so forth. My eye is always on extrapolation and generalization beyond. When that's systematically studied, there's still failure. So it doesn't cut anything to me to say that this specific sentence that Gary used in this 2022 paper called GPT-3 Bloviator, which was supposed to be called GPT-3 Bullshit Artist, but the editor wouldn't let me call it that. The specific examples that Ernie Davis and I had, then they might have trouble. But if you look at how that paper is organized, we said there are problems with causal reasoning, physical reasoning, psychological reasoning, et cetera, et cetera. And everywhere where we pointed to a problem, there's still, it's still very easy to elicit similar examples where there is a problem, even if the specific ones have maybe not been trained on or are now resolved. So it's not that there's been no progress, but the progress is always in that training space, never beyond.
So let's open it up to some questions from the audience. Back there. And do we have a mic going around? John Markoff.
Whether the governor is going to sign it or not?
I mean, I don't know if the governor is going to sign it. I have paid taxes in California and lived here briefly. I'm not a resident of California, for the record. I hope he signs it. It's not perfect. Various iterations is the right way to put it. It's been successively watered down, as happens in the political process when there's a lot of lobbying. I think that what it does now is relatively weak, but is much better than nothing. And I think the most important thing in a way is that there is a lot of talk about how if we have any law at all regulating AI, everybody's going to leave California, innovation is going to stop, China is going to leapfrog ahead. None of this stuff makes any sense whatsoever. And so if we have this little minor law that gives whistleblowers some protection and gives some means of liability through the Attorney General, if something really, really bad happens, life is going to go on, but it's going to normalize the notion that, can regulate AI, just like you regulate everything from food to drugs to airplanes to cars. So now let's have the real adult conversation, which is which regulation do we want? Which regulation do we want that doesn't stifle innovation, but that does, protect the human rights of the citizens of the United States? So I think we can finally get there once this is passed. I hope it will be.
I agree with Gary on the goal we want to get to. I think this bill I would have liked to have seen do a better job. As you say, it's been battled back and forth. I'm not sure that it arrived at quite the right place. I think we could have done a better job. And I think we've seen lots of examples of that where it's just hard to get these things right? So an example is in the European Union, we have this right to an explanation law that if an automated system makes a decision, you have the right to ask it what was the reasoning behind your decision. They wrote that law, and then they had to write another law that said it's still okay to have cars with anti-lock brakes. Because anti-lock brakes make automated decisions, but they are terrible at explaining themselves. They just stop the car, and you can't ask them a question. So they had to say that was okay. So if you have to write that second law, maybe you got the first law wrong. And I think we're kind of like that with the California bill.
For sure, not just California, although I think what you said is completely true. Any approach to AI legislation is going to have to be iterative. We're not going to get it right the first time. We're in uncharted waters, and it's going to take iteration.
Have the mic come forward. Make sure it's on.
Thank you very much. Hi, I'm Roger Spitz. Fascinating topics. Thank you. There's a significant focus, and I'm not an engineer, disclaimer, so please excuse my illiteracy, but there's a significant focus on the computer reasoning, decision outcomes on computers. I find in terms of the focus, a bit less on the impact on human decision-making, human agency, freedom and choice. And I'm just curious as to what you see in terms of descaling or other risks, which I think are linked maybe, but as big as a impact on democracies and others is really the sort of human decision-making outcomes of the reliance on decision outcomes from machines.
I'm going to take maybe one piece of that. Maybe I'll come back to the others, which is this descaling notion. Something that I'm really worried about is that low-end jobs, like beginning jobs, beginning coders, for example, are probably to some degree replaceable by LLMs. And we're going to wind up with this weird gap, I think, in many fields. This is just an intuition. I can't prove it. But where, for example, nobody becomes coder anymore because it's too hard to be better than, too hard to be better at the beginning of your career than an LLM. So people are like, I'm just not going to do that. The better software architects, better, L9 instead of L1 coders, whatever the language is, we're going to run out of them because nobody is going to go into X job. Same thing may happen in law and medicine and so forth. So we may have this thing where sort of mediocre work is done by AI and nobody really wants to be an expert anymore. I don't know. I'm curious what Peter's take is on that.
I guess I'm more optimistic. I think of, skills and being able to create programs is a combination of these technical skills and domain skills. And I think a lot of the technical skills will be taken over by the LLMs. In some ways, this is just a continuation of what we did, right? We used to write in assembly language. You're probably old enough, you did some of that. And then we made more human...
502 on a Commodore 64.
Yes. And we made more human-friendly languages as we realized the expense was really in the salaries and not in the hardware as much. So we've made things easier. I'm excited by more kind of end user, non-professional needs, right? So I have this friend who's PhD biologist, and he says, I'm not a programmer. I can pull some data out of a spreadsheet in order to make a chart to put in my publication, but I can't do much more than that. But he said, I got all this bird migration data. I always wanted like a nice visualization. And I knew a real programmer could do it, but I couldn't. But then I started playing with Copilot and I told it some things and now I built the app. And I never would have had the confidence to do it myself without that help. So I think that kind of sort of just-in-time end-user usage, I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
I think I agree with that. I mean, there may be some of both sides.
Good morning. Nice to see you here, Gary. My name is Nico. I'm the CEO of Prism Eval. Question to you as much as it is to Peter. So even if we say that LLMs are imperfect, it's about bridging the gap between governance and research agendas. LLMs are imperfect, but they remain and they're growing at the center of our managerial tables, governance, research, and others. And they remain huge black boxes, inscrutable. So in terms of the limits of mechanistic interpretability to help us move along that pathway quickly, it seems too that we may need additional agendas that try and look at them a bit like we would do with anthropology or ethology as cognitive artifacts, avoiding anthropomorphization. So in line with this logic of complementing what is already there, what types of, since we have to deal with them and formal verification won't work except in some cases when we break them down into task piece, what are you excited about in terms of what would you want to see in terms of the research agenda on a better interpretability of these models to help us bridge that gap towards governance? Because these things are here to stay, it seems.
Well, I mean, there's maybe what I want and what will happen. So I think that LLMs are always going to be uninterpretable. I like the work where people have tried to do what they call mechanistic interpretability. I don't think it's gotten very far. It all reminds me of neuroscience, which I've been following, since I was a graduate student in the Brain and Cognitive Science program at MIT in the late 80s, early 90s. And what I've seen in that field is mostly like, we can understand little bits here or there, but nobody would say, I can do a brain scan and fully understand what you're thinking and how you reached a decision. That's just so far away from where we are. And so you can do things like single cell recordings. You look at this cell and you say its preferred stimulus is Jennifer Aniston, and it doesn't fire as much to me because I'm not as pretty and whatever. So you can do these kinds of studies, and you get some interesting results. You get a Nature paper out of it. The media covers it, but we're still really a long way. And so now I'm seeing Anthropic publish essentially the same stuff, right? They're basically doing single cell recordings on quote neurons in large neural networks, and they made some interesting claims about superposition that are probably true and so forth. But it doesn't mean you can actually figure out what a neural net is doing. I would go even further and say that what neural networks do is they combine a lot of different things. This is the superposition that they're talking about, in ways that are not as abstract as what people do. So they're juxtapositions of circumstances rather than abstractions. What you want are abstractions, but I'm not sure they're even there. And so for me, it's a lost game. Like, as you point out, we might have to play the lost game because they're so dominant. But in the end, I expect that 10 years from now, we'll look back at this era and say, yeah, they had the right idea. AI could be amazing, but the tools they used really weren't amazing. And we moved to some more Bayesian interpretable footing that was much more data efficient, much more tractable. And we stopped using the LLMs. And that was kind of crazy how much money they put in that. And it's great that somebody eventually found a different way.
Thanks for an interesting discussion. To the extent we understand how our brain works, which
Not that much, but go on.
so that's part of the point and question. We don't, and then we're trying to surpass, that thinking, which let's say it's analog architecture, with something we don't understand, with something in a digital architecture. What do you think about that? How is that possible without actually understanding all the complexities of how the brain works and creating something that's better at what we do?
So I guess I have a few different thoughts on that. One is there are certain aspects of what we do as a human that nobody can give you a good neuroscience explanation for, that we can meet or exceed with AI already. So we can make better route planning systems than almost any human being. We all use them every day to navigate. That's AI. Same with chess, right? Even Kasparov can't beat the best chess computer. The best chess computer doesn't do it anything like a person does, and that's fine. So we don't have to understand how humans do things. But I would say there's some things that humans can do. I would look more at cognitive science than neuroscience, frankly, but there's some things humans do, like plan and reason and so forth, that they do much better than the best current machines. So we should at least look to humans for examples of how they do it. I think we should be spending much more money on cognitive science research, especially like the psychological side of cognitive science research, than we are. And what I see right now, where everybody's studying scaling and spending billions and billions of dollars on scaling, but tens of millions on cognitive science, I think that's absurd. So I think we should reorient what we're doing. But I don't think we're going to understand the brain circuit level for a long time. Yeah, I mean, that is a thread there that I didn't pull out. In fact, my last book was mostly about that. And generative AI is interesting because it presents itself as being general, unlike a chess computer. But I always think of it as a jack of all trades and master of none. There's nothing it does super reliably. So it's like a hint of what generality would be like, but I don't think it's the right solution to generality. I think the right solution to generality has to start with richer representations than we really get out of neural networks. And so that's a place where we might look to humans. Like, how do they pull off this generality? doing good experimental work there might actually give us a clue about how to make the AI.
I agree with the idea of looking at cognitive science. I would also like to look at organizational science. So rather than say, let's compare a single mind to a computer, let's compare how groups make decisions, right? And so some people are worried about, oh, what if there's a runaway superhuman intelligence? How will we deal with that? Well, we already have superhuman groups, and they're called nations and corporations. And
Universities.
University. And they make decisions not with a single mind, but with the groups that interact with each other. And I think we could learn a lot from that.
Hi, I'm a graduate student here, and I just wanted to follow up on the previous question because you mentioned cognitive science and organizational behavior. Maybe I wonder, like, what are the important questions in both domains that you think are worth solving? Because I think as a graduate student, a lot of people are really like jumping to the scaling, and then like things are very superhuman intelligence, but not really interest me as much as someone who's like studying more psychology and cognitive science or human behaviors.
I think the central questions are around abstraction, generalization, knowledge representation, and reasoning and planning. That none of those are super well understood, and that there is room, I think, to do much better. I'll put one addition to that, which is I believe that central to cognition is the notion of either a world model or cognitive model, whatever you want to call it. You can think of Kahneman and Treason's object files as one piece of that. You can think of Murphy and Medine's work on theories, and also Carey and Gopnik and so forth. Like, how does all that stuff work mechanistically? How do you enter a scene, let's say this room, and build a cognitive model of what's going on? So like, I have a physical model of this room, something of the geometry, how far away you might be. There are other people that are closer. I have psychological models of the individuals, like, you know, somebody up here, nobody, just making fun. Somebody could be sleeping, somebody's checking their email. Other people are rapidly paying attention. So I'm modeling all of that, and I can act on that. Like, if a robot comes in the room, which I know could happen in this building, I might expect people to respond in a particular way, or fire. So I'm constantly modeling what is happening. How do I do that? That seems to me to be amenable to psychological investigation. None of the current AI systems really extract models. And I'll say that, and there's a connection with Peter here in a way, I wrote a 2014 article in the New Yorker after someone allegedly passed the Turing test. And I said, we need a new Turing test. Because the original Turing test is just a test of human gullibility. And so what I suggested was story comprehension, which is actually very close to Peter's dissertation. How do you get something to watch an episode of Simpsons and know when to laugh, right? How do we do that, right? That was what I wrote in the New Yorker in 2014. And nobody has solved that task. There were rumors that Gemini did, but it didn't really, not reliable. How does, just the average person watch a movie or TV show and know what's going on? They're constructing a model of an alternate world in the course of that. There might be some science fiction principle. I'm watching a Netflix show called Supercell, where people have powers. I haven't quite watched the end. Don't give it away if you've seen it. Like, how do I do that and learn like what can and cannot be done in this alternative world and stick to its principles rather than everyday principles? And it borrows some from the normal world and some others. Like, how do we do that kind of computation? I think a good answer to that could take us a long way.
We'll grab some.
Oh, also, if you really answer it, I'll be on your dissertation committee.
I was going to grab a couple of questions from Zoom here. So first, Gary, how do you perceive media coverage of AI over the past couple of years? What important stories or angles do you think have been overlooked?
Criticism is mostly overlooked. I mean, I shouldn't say that because I get some coverage as a critic, but I would say I get less than I would like, and it's not just me. There's an enormous number of articles that glorify Sam Altman, who I think actually has a number of issues that we might be concerned with, and far fewer about those that are skeptical. So Sam Altman sneezes, and 4,000 articles about his latest estimate on AGI timelines. Honestly, Sam's not where I would go for an AGI timeline. There are lots of academics who I think actually are more knowledgeable about what are the challenges that need that. I think the media just mostly by default goes to the press releases from the big companies, and that's a problem.
Yeah, I'll grab another one here. So the state of California recently sued Exxon over plastics recycling deception. And the question is, are we not running the same risks with AI? By the time AI effects are understood, our world may be so polluted with AI content, it'll be too late.
Totally running. I love Cory Doctorow's term shitification. The internet is getting shitified every day by bad outputs from LLMs and so forth.
So, end of that question then is, what should we ask then of tech companies before they unleash unproven innovations on society?
One of the things I recommend in the book, Taming Silicon Valley, is a kind of pre-approval process. If you're going to deploy something, let's say 100 million, you should have to show that the benefits outweigh the risks. OpenAI has done a good job of laying out the risks for each of their models, recent models, and a very poor job of justifying why those risks are worth bearing. So, they said we might increase bioweapons risk. Well, if you're doing that, it's really worth it? Why? And I think, again, there should be an approval process with independent oversight.
So can I jump in? As I remember Cory's enshitification article, it was more about social networks and communication than about AI.
I've tried to extend it to AI.
Yeah. So I think he says we built this system where anybody can say anything and it can be magnified without any provenance and without any sort of quality behind it. And I guess maybe I'm old-fashioned, but I sort of yearn for the old days when there were 3 networks and maybe they were slanted in their view, but you knew Walter Cronkite wasn't just making stuff up. And eventually he would come along and say, that Vietnam War thing that I said was okay, maybe it's not okay after all. And now you can get any voice saying anything, and I think we're worse off for that.
I'm with you. I'm just as much an old fart as you. I miss those days too. I watched Walter Cronkite when I was a little kid. I don't think that society has become improved on the whole as a function of the kind of radical free speech that we're talking about. I strongly believe in radical free speech, but I think we're undervalued fact-checking right now. And I think that society needs to be a balance between anybody can say what they want, but there has to be some kind of fact-checking machinery or something like that. Social media basically killed traditional media. And traditional media spent a lot of money trying to make sure that it was mostly right. And we've paid a price. We have a dysfunctional society now. That's a pretty large price.
And I have a vision of a possible future where there's sort of this boomerang effect, where if we get these deep fakes, maybe we'll get to the point where people say, maybe I should be worried about this. And maybe I should look more to provenance of where this is coming from. And
that would be a good outcome. The bad outcome that's not very far from that is that nobody trusts anything. If you think about the Russian fire hose of propaganda model, which is basically Putin's model, the idea is to flood the zone with shit, and then nobody trusts anything. That's actually, I think, where we're headed. It would be good if we have a rebirth of people thinking about provenance, thinking critically, etc. And bad if people are just like, I'm just going to trust my buddy and nobody else.
Right. Do you have another one, or are we going to pass the mic around?
Before I hand it off, I'll just put one more out there from Zoom. So what actions would you suggest for someone with money or time who wants to defend artists, journalists, and publishers from non-consensual use of their work for training models and competition from AI?
And the thing that I would most like to see, I know it's a fantasy, but what I would like to see is a boycott. I would like us to think the way we think about coffee. You don't want to take coffee made by exploited workers. And so there's a notion of fairly sourced coffee or fairly sourced chocolate and so forth. I think we should say, we love generative AI. It does so many things for us, but we're going to wait until you sort these things out. I'm not going to use your generative AI painting program until you license all the sources. I'm not going to use your hiring software as long as I know that you're going to be discriminating against people who maybe have different skin color, because they speak in a slightly different language. I'm just not going to use this software. not going to use it as an employee or as an owner and so forth. I think if we took collective action and said, get your house in order, you have lots of funding, take a little time, make this stuff work, and then we'll use it. In the meantime, we will wait. I think that could be incredibly powerful if people of the world organized. And also we could say, get down the climate costs by, let's say, a factor of 100. Come back to us. It's got to be doable. The brain works on 20 watts. Why does Microsoft need the entire output of 3 Mile Island? Come back to us when you don't.
Yeah, I'm optimistic that we'll get there on those kinds of costs.
Climate stuff or all of it?
On the climate and power costs, right? So I was talking with Kai-Fu Lee last week, and he says, "Oh, we're 35 times more efficient than we were last year, and we think there's a lot more headroom." So I think
there's definitely more headroom. I mean, this is my point about 20 watts: is it's possible, right? I mean, humans don't need to train on the entire internet in order to function well. Maybe they can look things up, but they don't need to literally train on them. It's got to be possible. I'm just saying we should demand better and say, come back when you solve the problem. I mean, like we do with the, gas mileage train. Like we say, the great state of California said, like, get your numbers down and then, or up depending on how you want to think about the scale, and then you can put the cars on the road. So just, we need some standards.
Okay, the mic's going around.
The answer to this question might be read the book, but I'm curious, for those of us who work in technology, how can we be better partners to governments, policymakers, and so on, so that we're not making policies just out of fear?
Up in the tech community?
Yeah.
I think the tech community has to start by having some soul searching here. I think that when I met Peter and he was at Google, which I think was 2011 or 12, Google took seriously "Don't be evil." And that was the culture in the Valley. And I was happy as an academic to kind of visit. Now, my skin crawls when I'm in San Francisco, thinking about certain companies I don't have to name, because I think the values have changed. I think, we could look at AI as a genuine opportunity to change the world, or we can be like, how are we going to make money off of this? And those lead to different places. My guess is that OpenAI is going to become the most Orwellian company of all time, right? They're already called open when they're not open. And I think what they're going to be pressed to do is to become a surveillance company, because I don't think they can make the money they need to justify the valuations by doing business services, stuff like that. And so you look, and OpenAI wants to train on all your data. They bought a share in a webcam company. Employees should say, I don't want to be part of this, right? It really comes down to employees. What do you want to be part of?
I had a question on the energy usage point. So the human brain functions on 20 watts of energy on average, but it's also true that, for example, an average human being in say the US has about $60,000 of productivity a year, right? I mean, so it seems that before you get to a human brain, assuming it's all brain, that would produce billions of dollars in productivity, you have to go through millions of these 20-watt brains, which are not super productive, actually. So maybe it makes sense.
Kids are really fun to play with in the meantime.
Okay. But yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to say is that the nature's process of producing intelligence or human brains, it needs to go through millions and maybe billions of energetic human beings before it gets to an Einstein or a Newton or something like that, or something, or a truly encyclopedic brain or something. So it may not be as efficient either in nature, actually. So maybe the 20-watt comparison is not absolutely accurate.
I hear you on the glibness of the 20-watt comparison. I think there's something to it, but I would stand by the notion there's a ton of headroom. There are lots of things you could do with machines that you can't do with people, like copy, databases and stuff. between them. So I'm absolutely sure there's headroom, though it is true that it takes a long time to train a individual human being, college, and all of that, and so forth. So like I see an element to what you say, but I also still think that there's a lot of headroom.
Who else? Somebody up front?
Could I cue Peter up for one of my favorite lines of his?
Sure.
Which is, I think I once saw someone say, how are we going to replicate human intelligence? And you had a line about your personal experience. You remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah. So I said, I think AI is for making tools that will help us. I don't want to replicate humans because we know how to do that the old-fashioned way. My wife and I did it twice. She did more of the work than I did. I admit that. But we don't need copycat people. We need tools to help us be better people.
Completely agree, and always love that story.
Could we go back to governance for a moment? You talk about worrying about democracy, but a lot of the other great powers are not focused on the same values that we are. So how do you come up with a governance model that works internationally?
I mean, we're not going to have a single governance model that extends to all situations. I think there's actually a lot of intersection in what, say, US and China want. Like there's a lot of, what about China? We can't do this. China doesn't want AI regulation. And actually, China does want AI regulation. There are parts of their model I do not want for us, like that LLMs have to be consistent with the party voice. I hope we will never do that here. I fear that our next president, if it's the person I'm voting against, might push in that direction. But in general, I expect not to see that sort of thing. But every country wants its citizens not to be constantly ripped off by cybercrime and impersonation scams, outside agitators, etc. And so China actually is more active on AI regulation than we are, and has been very willing to come to the table to have discussion. So it's just a myth that there's no intersection there. There's certainly not perfect overlap in the way. And Russia, I think, is the hardest to deal with. Like, I'm not sure what the common ground is with them. I'm much more sure with China.
Hey, so there's, the first wave of companies that have come out, the big ones being OpenAI and Anthropic, et cetera. And then there's kind of this new wave that's popping up, like Ilya's new company, SSI, which has, the word safe in the name.
It's like having the word open. Like, let's see what that means.
Right. So but that's my question. Do you guys believe that new crops of companies can come up that will do things differently than this first crop? And do you believe that there are approaches that are already being taken by that new crop, or that you're bullish will be taken?
I'm dark on that. I think it's possible, but I think that the incumbent advantage in terms of infrastructure, data, and money is huge, and it makes it very hard for the startups. 3 big startups in the last year had defections from the top, right? So inflections, people went off to Microsoft, leaving part of the company, but the CEO left. Same thing happened with Adept, and now with Character AI. These were people running some of the biggest AI companies. They had huge amounts of funding to play with, and they still made the calculation that they were better off leaving, and not leaving in like huge exits either. I think it's hard right now to start up. Yeah, I think it's possible that someone will come up with an entirely better technology, and good luck to Ilya. But most people are building essentially the same, deep learning systems trained on massive databases. There's not that much intellectual moat, at least for the things we're seeing. And if there's not much moat, then there's a big incumbent there. So I'm not saying no, but it's a hard road.
I like seeing this diversity, and I think Gary has a good point that a lot of these founders of the small companies say, I can get more done in a big company, and so I go back there. But there is this opportunity to specialize more, right? So we built this technology where you can say, I can get a foundation model and add something on top of that. And like, Gary was saying with coffee, you can say, I'm going to put a sticker on my version that has the following qualities. Maybe the big company wouldn't want to go in that direction, but the small companies can fit those niches. So I think that's a possibility.
And there are niches like healthcare. If you get some unique data, you might be able to do something. So it's not that I think there's no hope, but I think it is a challenging.
I'll jump in with a couple more questions from our Zoom audience. So we've spoken about the role of society broadly, of government, and of CEOs like Sam Altman. But what about employees within tech industry? Do rank and file tech employees have ethical duties when developing and deploying products? And if so, how should they exercise?
I don't see how you get away from your ethical responsibility just because you're rank and file. And I've seen too many people in Silicon Valley work for high salaries to do things that I think are unethical. I would never have worked for Meta, for example, or Facebook in any of its incarnations, at least after like the first year or two when it became clear that they were gaming the attention economy and really kind of messing up society. I don't think because you're a junior person there that you're exempt and you say, well, Mark makes all the decisions. You can walk with your feet. People have been walking from OpenAI. A lot of like 10 or 15 employees in the last 10 months or something like that have walked, and good for them. They have walked to make a statement about the insincerity of management with respect to AI alignment. And I'm glad they've done that.
I guess I see some real positives in what the companies are doing, right? So all the companies have their sets of AI principles, and they've got their training procedures, and they've got their sort of access capabilities of you can only look at this if you have permission and if you've taken this training course and so on. And overall, they're kind of better than I expected, right? Because I'm used to a lot of this corporate training of, oh, you have to take this class where they're going to ask you, should you give this foreign official a bribe? Oh, guess what? The answer is no. Wow.
Was anybody looking?
But I think some of these AI principles are deeper than that, and there are good materials there. And I think the employees do learn from that. I guess one of the things I'm worried about is that seems to be true at the big companies, but at the small companies, they don't have time for that. So in some sense, I'm more worried about them.
A few more from the room. Nope.
Yeah. So kind of jumping off the point that you made about boycotting these companies until they start licensing and things like that. I don't know if this is like a hope or a fantasy, but how would you realistically compensate people for the content that's trained on these like LLMs? I think there's a couple of things, right? And like how expensive it would be. Also in like how you would value different sources of information based on how useful they are to the LLMs.
I can start with what would be perfect, but cannot be done for now. What would be perfect is every time an answer is produced, you do what we would call source attribution. You say, where did this answer come from? If it's 3% from here and 5% from there, then you just compensate people accordingly. Of course, that's the alphas. How much money gets allocated is a complicated negotiation. The problem is we don't actually know how to do that. So LLMs are black boxes. We don't know where the answers come from. And that's a huge technical problem. The best we can do right now is really which sources were used in the overall training, but we can't do it, trial by trial. That's a real problem. It's a reason, again, to press for better technology. So, for example, if you take many of these generative AI programs and you say, draw me a picture of an Italian plumber, they will give you Mario, the Nintendo character, but they can't tell you that they did that. You could imagine software that would know what are its sources. That would be better. We could push for that. we could say you can't do this unless you can do the attribution in some way that's convincing.
Yeah.
Companies can afford it. I mean, well, I guess there's two ways to think about that. One is, most of these companies are valued in the billions of dollars. So of course they can afford it. The other way to think about it is they're all losing money. So I mean, you can think about it that way too.
I guess nothing is we do have ways of doing that, but it's like, let's build two versions of this model, one with this content and one without, and compare the difference, right? And so now you've doubled your cost and you don't have a lot left over to give to the content creators. I ran into this recently. My publisher asked, do you want to sign this that allows us to negotiate with these LLM companies to license your book? I said yes. One of my co-authors said no, so we're trying to figure it out. But I was thinking, what would be fair? And I think the fairest thing was the publishers should negotiate for a set fee, and then they should allocate it to the authors in proportion to their book sales, right? Because that's something that they can measure and say, this book is more popular than that one, therefore you get a bigger share. And if it's more popular to the general audience, it's probably more popular to the LLM audience, right?
And it gets complicated fast, because that means like John Grisham gets most of the share, but what exactly are the systems learning from the Grisham novels? So it is complicated if you have to do it at that grain rather than at the grain of this particular answer came in this way.
I think we're out of time. Even one more question.
You got it. Curriculum assessment is a good question. I can answer a different question, which is what should teachers do in light of a world where LLMs are ubiquitous and students are using them? What I have suggested, and has become sometimes known as the Marcus method, is you let the students use it, and then you say, let's evaluate the output. Are there hallucinations? If you were going to write an essay on this, how could you make it more interesting? Because LLMs are usually dull. What perspective and angle could you take? So somebody posted this on Twitter. They said, I tried out the Marcus method. This was the best free advertising I ever got because their result was so striking. They said, I tried it out, 63 students, all 63 of them found hallucinations. And so the tweet went viral. So that's what I suggest in terms of, the reality of it is you can't really interdict this stuff. You can't say students shouldn't use it, but let's turn it into a learning experience. Help the kids learn about AI, how to reason critically about its outputs and so forth.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of moves. I know one teacher says, here's your essay assignment, and here's what ChatGPT does, so you have to be better than that. Another one says, here's the assignment, and I want you to get a language model to say something that's wrong and tell me why it's wrong. Another thing is, why do we rely so much on essays? And I think the reason is, one, it's everybody has materials. It used to be you needed a paper and pencil, then you needed a typewriter, then you needed a word processor, but everybody has access to that. And then also we felt like if you could write coherent paragraphs, you had something going on. And now we know maybe that's not so true. Maybe writing coherent paragraphs isn't a real proof. But I also think it opens up for more creative assignments. Don't just say you're going to write an essay. Say, read this novel and respond to it. And maybe now somebody could say, oh, well, the way I'm going to respond to it is I'm going to make a short movie. And that used to be a year-long assignment, but now you can use these tools, and in a week you can come up with something credible, or maybe something else that's creative in a different way. So I think the teachers who are stuck saying, I want to do things the way I always did, they're going to run into trouble. And the ones that are creative and want to move forward will have good opportunities.
Thank you both so much for this amazing discussion. I think everybody was asking wonderful questions. If you would like to give a round of applause for our wonderful speakers.